Greetings, friends. I recently came across this YouTube channel, Rare Earth. And the front man of this channel is a young man named Evan Hadfield. And I was watching some of the videos. I found them really annoying, but I saw how they utilized the standard leftist narrative of oppression, that white peoples have oppressed all the other peoples of the world, and we can't judge the other peoples of the world. We just have to listen to them and we can tell their stories, but we can't understand these people ourselves. And I had to get to know a bit more about Evan Hadfield. He turns out to be the son of Chris Hadfield, the astronaut who's promoted by the mainstream media because he's such a safe guy who won't question anything about the status quo. So that's his father. Then I went to Evan Hadfield's Twitter profile just to see, like, is this guy as much of a liberal as I think he is? And oh yes, he's even more of a liberal than I thought he was. These are some of his tweets from about a month ago, about around early September, when I was taking these screenshots. And he says in this one, "I'm constantly amazed at how intelligent, headstrong, and morally good in quotation marks, most of the YouTube educating community is. The site may be a cesspool on the whole, but it has allowed for some really amazing people to shine." So the two interesting things here, he's putting good in quotation marks. I guess that's because if you're a faithful liberal, you can't believe in absolutes. Everything has to be relative. So you better cover that good in quotation marks. Cover your bases. Good man. And then, of course, he's referring to most of YouTube as a cesspool because most of YouTube has been, up until this point in time, right-wing. Because it was the only place where truly right-wing content could flourish because it wasn't fully controlled by big corporations, by government, by the big institutions. I mean, YouTube is a corporation too, and they are cracking down on this. Now, to be fair, they're cracking down on ultra left-wing content too, but certainly it has been mostly right-wing up until recently. That is changing. So I'm part of that cesspool probably in Evan's mind. So how nice of him. I'm sure he could understand what I have to say. I'm sure he would be open ears. And then he retweeted a link to this article. YouTube should stop recommending garbage videos to users. And this is just part of the idea that YouTube is making it too easy to find right-wing content which they describe as, National Socialist Germany, that kind of content. And that's what these people really think. He's tweeting here this poll from the Spectator Index. These are the percentages of people who say immigrants strengthen their country. In Canada, it's 68%. In Australia, it's 64%, which, of course, to me is terrible. That's 68% too much. I mean, that's crazy. That shows that our civilization is in complete decline, suicidal decline. But then Evan's comment on this, and by the way, when we say immigrants, we don't mean historical immigrants, economically beneficial immigrants. We mean different races, very different cultures, not European immigrants. 68% of Canadians think that, diversity is our strength, and Evan believes that diversity is our strength. Who says that diversity is our strength? Do you hear that from the major corporations? Do you hear that from the major media and the big institutions? Of course you do. Believe them. They know exactly what you have to believe. And Evan's comment on this poll is not to rejoice that the brainwashing has been so effective for the globalists. Instead, he's bemoaning the fact, and he's saying, what I'm seeing here is that 32% of Canada is willfully blind. So that's not enough for him. We have to be completely accepting that diversity is our strength, when of course it's not our strength. So if you believe that a white country getting progressively more and more brown, more mixed, less white people, less European traditions, less Christianity, less free speech, less of our traditions. Not all of our traditions are great. I'm not a big fan of democracy, but all that Western heritage, that going away, for that to be seen as a bad thing, which I think obviously it is, in his mind, that you are not only being blind, you are purposefully going out of your way to cover your eyes, to not see the truth. So it's the astounding arrogance of Evan and his channel that just drew me to do more analysis of him and to do more analysis of his channel. Now, does this liberal like animals? Is he an animal lover? Yep, he's an animal lover too. I know animal lovers aren't all lefties. I know it doesn't always go together, but a lot of the time these things go together. When you find out one thing about a person, then you find out something else. They're for diversification of our countries. They're for animal lovers. They're for the oppression narrative. And here he is with his dog, big smelly dog with its legs apart, its private area exposed. And he's lying with a dog in a bed the way that you would lie with your woman on the bed. Isn't there some injunction in the Bible against that? I don't think Evan would really care about what the Bible has to say. I don't know if it says about animals. It says you shall not lie with man as you lie with woman. But anyways, and he says, my wife doesn't let me on my dog on the bed, so when she showers in the morning, he sneaks up to me all quietly. I'm such a sucker. Wonderful, Evan. I'm sure that room really stinks. So anyways, let's get on to the main subject of this video, which is his video from Rare Earth titled, Is Haile Selassie God? In the video description, it says, God is just what we make of it, even when they aren't. Let's leave aside the fact that this is grammatically incorrect. The first sentence, God is just what we make of it. This piqued my interest, striking me as something an atheist or pantheist might say. I assume he means to say God is just what we make of it, even when he isn't. Or in other words, God only exists in our minds. God's not out there. Anyways,
you wake up to a neighboring tribe rampaging through your village. They have weapons that you can't understand. You can't fight back. They murder your elders, shackle together the rest, and march them towards the coast. On that walk, your sister will die. When you get there, you will never see your family again.
I have to give this lefty credit. I would never expect the average lefty to admit that Africans sold their fellow Africans into the hands of the European and Jewish slave traders. At least that was what happened in West Africa, while in East Africa the Arabs had been taking slaves for 1,000 years. Perhaps whites could have captured slaves directly in South Africa. I don't know. African tribes warring on each other and taking slaves is something that goes against the story of big, bad Western oppression. Many people imagine that white men went far into the interior with machine guns and they captured slaves directly, when in reality the traders and soldiers were confined to their coastal bases. True, the odd missionary and explorer may have ventured inland, but on the whole, going inland meant almost certain death to Europeans, either from disease or from hostile African natives who were far more militarily powerful than any North American Indian tribe. There were some European military expeditions into the continent later on in the 19th century, but this was long after both the British and French empires had abolished the slave trade.
There at the coast, there are boats waiting with men who you can't understand. They have a different language, a different culture, and yet they own you. As you get on that ship, they put you below deck and stack you like cordwood. Your neighbor dies, they pull him out and throw him to the sharks. After weeks of waiting, you finally arrive in your new island prison home. There, you'll die. Your children will die.
Hold on. Your children will die? Meaning your children that came on the voyage with you? I mean, it's not like the slaves actually reproduced themselves in the New World, right? Slaves having babies in Brazil or Cuba or South Carolina? Nah, never happened. The Africans would be killed off in the New World. Everyone knows that. Their descendants would never come to outnumber the whites today in many of the regions where they landed. That just couldn't happen. Those regions today are whiter than white. The white slave owners in America castrated their slaves just like the Arabs did to their slaves. That's how they managed to keep Africans from breeding in the New World.
But before they've worked you to death on that plantation, they are going to force you to learn a new language. Their language. They're going to force you to take on a new culture. Their culture. Or they'll whip you. They'll whip you. They'll whip you.
Evan has a very annoying tone. To be fair, he's talking about a serious subject, so he's trying to sound serious. But that doesn't mean you have to ooze moral indignation. We're still early in the video, and he already seems to be virtue signaling. Now, I'm sure many or even most of the early slaves were indeed worked to death, but so were a lot of white indentured laborers who were enslaved for 7 years. The whole reason the Europeans switched from using whites to using Africans is that the latter are physically stronger. They can endure tropical fevers much better. Then he says that a new culture was forced on the African slaves. Let's think about this. Was the slave owner going to be barking at his slaves in English or French? Yeah, but so what? It's not like there were too many complicated ideas to communicate to a slave who had to pick cotton or sugarcane. In fact, except for a small number of more capable and intelligent slaves who were selected to work in the manor houses, the vast majority of slaves were left unsupervised most of the day. Of course, they'd pick up their own version of English over time, but it was hardly rammed down their throats. Yes, there were missionaries, and the missionaries taught Christianity, and they probably required attendance at church, and they did teach their European language to the slaves. But you can't just force people into a new religion or you'll turn them away. Look at Vodun or Voodoo flourishing in Haiti as an example. Look at all the African influence in Brazilian music. This is hardly a case of Africans being brainwashed by Western culture. No. In many cases, it seems it was the African culture which had the strongest influence on the descendants of slaves. They were obviously westernized in certain ways, such as with Christianity. The truth is that many Africans liked what Christianity had to offer, and they still do today, just like when pagan Europeans embraced Christianity, a religion which came originally from the Middle East. How is the white man conquering you with his religion when the white man himself was also conquered by that same religion some centuries previously?
But most of all, you're going to learn to love a new God. Their God.
A Christian would not say our God. God cannot be possessed by anyone. He is simply God because he's the only one. It's true that so-called Christians have used violence in the past to bend non-Christians to their will. The Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne forced Eastern Europeans to convert under threat of death, though Charlemagne himself probably did not have much knowledge of Christian teachings very well, the same way Constantine would not have had much knowledge of Christianity either. Both Constantine and Charlemagne viewing Christianity as a means to earthly power. In addition, the Spanish and the Portuguese in the New World were particularly brutal in their dealings with indigenous people, and the Americans only somewhat less violent. Though it must be said that in many of these cases the indigenous people were just as violent. However, to think that the entire story of the spread of Christianity was about forceful conversion is simply wrong. By learning to love their God, Evan suggests colonized peoples were put in some kind of Orwellian indoctrination. He doesn't seem interested in the notion that many non-European peoples saw the value of adopting Christianity, just like the pagan Europeans did in the past. No, Evan would probably say something like the following. All the traditions of the world teach exactly the same fundamental truths, or they teach no fundamental truths. Either way you look at it, truth is just relative. There is no ultimate source of truth in the good. These are the kind of assumptions Evan must have, whether he's explicitly aware of it or not.
This is not the story of slavery. This is the story of Rastafarianism, of inequality, the fire where new religions are forged. I'm not meant to understand Rastafarianism. Despite the fact that as a young man I made the very regrettable decision of growing dreadlocks, it isn't a religion for me. The experiences it details aren't mine.
Saying that a white person can't understand another culture is just a typical virtue signaling tactic. I'm so meek, to the point where I won't even claim to have understanding of other cultures. Using anthropology to gain insight about other peoples is impossible because you're always ethnocentric. You always have white privilege. Only a Rasta can understand Rastafarianism. Well, Evan, if that's what you think, what if you read dozens of books about Rastafarianism? What if you hang out with real-life Rastas? You're going to have some understanding of their culture, if not a perfect one. Obviously, you don't know what it feels like to be anyone other than yourself, but you can still understand a lot about other people and other cultures if you have intellectual persistence.
My family immigrated to the New World intentionally.
Maybe his family came to the New World intentionally, but not all of the European settlers were coming from great economic circumstances. They made the trip not because they were thrilled about it, but because they were somewhat desperate trying to survive in Britain, especially after enclosure of the countryside had driven so many into poverty.
We could read the Bible in our own language. We could come to the culture on our own terms.
Yes, because no missionaries ever translated the Bible into indigenous languages. Certainly, that didn't happen. And in the cases where people had to learn to read English, it was often a case where there was no pre-existing indigenous writing system. Even if English wasn't their native language, learning to read the English Bible would have been a great step up in literacy for many African tribes and Native American tribes.
My family could have farms, we could have shops, we could even have one of our progeny become an important national icon.
Here, Evan is referring to his father, the astronaut Chris Hadfield. It's nice that he's proud of his dad, but he tends to mention him too frequently. I only watched a couple of Rare Earth videos in full, and I perused through another small handful of his videos. Just from this relatively small sample, Evan mentions his dad 5 or 6 times. Now, I respect Chris Hadfield for being an astronaut, but I don't like his personality, nor do I care for anything he's done for Canada. A useful idiot for the establishment media. All the major networks and newspapers will give Chris Hadfield airtime because he has nothing of substance to say, because he's totally for the status quo.
Certainly, we had our hardships, but our struggle was mostly against nature, not man. And because of this, our religion was primarily against nature as well. Prayers were saved for harvest time and meals.
He's suggesting that Christianity was against nature because the prayers were for harvest and there were prayers at mealtime? So because you're praying for a good harvest, your religion is against nature? What an idiotic statement. In Christianity, it says that man should rule over the creatures of the earth, but I don't think that's against nature.
Church was too far from the farm, so it lost its importance in the routine. Those of my family that sustained their beliefs through the generations did so with confidence that their God viewed them as most important. Their farm was the center of the world, and nobody was around to tell them otherwise. But for a slave in Jamaica or the American interior, God was not theirs to hold. Belief was fundamental, required even.
Yeah, they had to go to church, just like Europeans were taught to go to church. it was a good idea. Humans don't automatically deserve the freedom to do whatever they want. There are good traditions and less good traditions. Some traditions are better than others. Christianity is for all the races of the earth. There is one God, and we are here on His terms, regardless of how worldly politics plays out. You can focus on the corruption of institutional actors, disregarding the fact that these corrupt institutions go against their own teachings, disregarding the fact that these teachings have made a real and positive impact on changing societies around the world, and they've done so regardless of corruption. True, there are nominally Christian countries such as Mexico and some African countries where there's a high level of corruption, violence, and suffering. But can you honestly say these countries were better off before being Christianized? Only if you collapse into relativism can you deny that, on the whole, even these troubled countries are still better off with Christianity. They are still more civilized and more peaceful than how they were before.
But they were never going to be the center of anything, the most important beings.
Again, he seems stuck on this notion that historically Christians viewed themselves as the most important beings because of their religion. No, being made in the image of God does not mean you are the most important beings. I mean, it means you're more important than animals, but it doesn't mean you're more important than other races. So he seems to be confusing racial superiority with Christianity. He probably doesn't realize that Hitler, for example, was not a fan of Christianity.
The preachers who could read the holy words weren't reading for the sake of slaves. They presided over a congregation black bodies couldn't join. God spoke a language it would take them years to learn. They simply weren't the most important beings. They may have been God's children, but they weren't the firstborn. They would never inherit the family farm.
Who cares if one people has lower status than another? Status distinctions are typical throughout history because there is natural inequality within each tribe, just as there is natural inequality between the various peoples of the world. I only care if the upper class abuses their responsibilities, or if the lower classes abuse their responsibilities. And it's nice to allow for some mobility between classes so that those who are deserving can move up in class and those who are undeserving can be lowered. But class itself is natural, even if their boundaries may be porous. Even Karl Marx realized that there will always be inequality in the world.
Generations passed, and while slavery was outlawed and the world changed, the center never shifted. Oppressive laws, cultural practices, and organizations sprung up to replace what had come before. Black people across the Americas, despite being ostensibly free, were undeniably second-class citizens, even to their God.
Yes, the law was unequal because the United States was founded as a European nation. The blacks were seen as outside this nation, a completely different tribe, just like the Native Americans. The U.S. founders did not conceive of the blacks being citizens. And why would they have? Can I become a citizen in Ghana today? Probably not. The Ghanaians have no reason to give full political rights to a white man or to a Chinese man. I think the Ghanaian government has made a good decision. It doesn't bother me that I can never become a citizen in their country. Just because there was an economic relationship between whites and blacks in America doesn't mean that the two groups are therefore citizens. For much of history, being a citizen was a difficult position to obtain, even within your own ethnic group. Do you think it would have been easy to be a citizen in ancient Greece just because you were a Greek person? You'd be more likely to be a slave.
By now, most newly freed slave families would have a firm belief in Christianity, but their savior was still painted as a white man. Their God still did not believe them to be firstborn. And in this backdrop, new religions began to emerge. Those that could still remember the beliefs of their forefathers attempted to reconcile the rift by adding African voices to the otherwise European cacophony. Black preachers, now literate, began to turn a gospel of their own. In the southern parts of the African continent, a concept called Ethiopianism was born, and it would spread across the world. It believed primarily in the idea of Africa for Africans. In many ways, it mirrored the racism that birthed it into the world, but without the cultural and military superiority to back it up.
I don't have any problem with Africa for Africans. He's calling the Africans racist for wanting to keep their own continent racially and culturally pure. This just goes to show how liberals don't actually respect the peoples they claim to speak for. It also goes to show why racism is a stupid word. If you accuse others of racism, eventually it's going to be used against you too. In the end, everyone becomes a racist, which is absurd. You could, however, describe Evan Hadfield as a bigot, both towards his own people, whom he sees as wolves, and to the Africans, whom he regards as helpless people whose beliefs cannot be taken seriously. Of course, Africa is not all Bantu people. There's the Arab people in North Africa, there's the Khoisan, there's the Pygmies. We've already talked about how Ethiopians have a lot of mixing, and you know, the Horn of Africa. Still, if the Bantus, who occupy more than half of the continent, if they want to keep their portion of Africa Bantu, then all the power to them.
This wasn't a religion of unity, just as it hadn't been born from a religion of unity. It was a religion of racial superiority. And while they still believed in the God of their invaders, his ever-loving gaze would now look first to black faces. They would inherit the earth as promised. And in that world of upheaval, a man was born in Jamaica named Marcus Garvey. He was intelligent, he was educated, and he was mad as hell. For everything else he was, though, Garvey was an undeniable racist. He was a black supremacist and best understood the world through the lens of race war. His response to being raised as a second-class citizen was not to fight for equalization, but separation.
What do we mean by supremacy? That one group is better than another? Better how? Better swimmers? Better runners? Better at math? Sure, it does sound to me like Mr. Garvey didn't have any love for white people. That's what I condemn, simply disliking another people for no good reason, not even giving foreigners a chance to change your mind. However, Garvey isn't wrong to see the value in segregation between groups. It should not be a nightmarish situation where one group swoops in like vampires to prey on another group. It should be a situation where we mind our business, you mind yours. If our peoples need to cooperate, we can send a limited number of capable individuals into the midst of the other group, and it is the other group's responsibility to respect this limited group of foreigners within their midst. Separate, but peacefully interacting.
In a liberated Africa, he proposed, black men could be free to rule as they pleased, to achieve on their own merits, to conquer, subjugate, and oppress other races as had been done to them.
Bantu people already oppressed other races in the past. The Pygmies of Central Africa and the Khoisan of Southern Africa.
He didn't have the same dream as Martin Luther King Jr. He dreamed of segregation. And to this end, he would continue the work of white racists in populating the American colony of Liberia, starting an ocean liner meant to bring back as many black Americans to the African continent as possible. The goal was to be separate, but it was certainly not to be equal. And although these words of division stab me and probably many of you like a dagger, much like the Rastafarianism that would branch from them, they were never really meant for me. He was speaking to the black people once enslaved in the Americas, and it was in those populations where some people began to heed his call. Especially among the lowest class communities, hearing that they may someday be truly free, in charge, and the center of both God and man's attention couldn't be overstated.
Christians do not believe they're the center of God's attention. God gives his attention to all things. It's not a popularity contest.
They weren't concerned if it was the same form of racism, only with their race at the helm. They were the underdog, and the underdog is always waiting for its day. Garvey's ideology became a prophecy, and soon he began to be treated as a prophet. Those that practice the new religion now claim that in 1920, a pseudo-religious Garvey instructed his followers to, quote, "Look to Africa, where a black king will be crowned. He will be your redeemer." And although he almost certainly never said those words, their meaning had long since been believed. 10 years later, Haile Selassie, otherwise known as Rastafari, the Lion of Judah, a man who could claim his lineage back to Solomon, was named emperor. To many, this was the prophecy come true. The fact that it had happened in Ethiopia only further confirmed it. It was the birthplace of African Christianity, Zion. For his own part, Garvey was no supporter of Selassie. To him, he was a coward for running from Italian invasion. To him, the fact that the slave trade still existed in Ethiopia showed what a sham his Pan-African ideals truly were. The fact that he spent more time with American and European dignitaries over those from African and black nations was near traitorous.
Haile Selassie never allowed the public to see photos of his mother, but she was likely not from African origin. Looking at photos of Haile Selassie himself, he appears more like a Middle Easterner than a sub-Saharan African. In fact, Ethiopians today do not see themselves as sub-Saharans or as Bantus. They see themselves as a separate group, what may be called Cushitic. There's actually lots of genetic diversity within Ethiopia. Some Ethiopians do appear to be like Bantus. Others appear very differently.
But to the true believers, the coronation of Haile Selassie meant the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. His expulsion by fascist Italy and subsequent return only furthered their beliefs. He was the prodigal king, and he would be the unifier of all Africans, the next coming of Jesus. No pressure, though. All across the working class regions of Jamaica, black supremacist preachers began to speak the gospel of Ethiopia, of Rastafari. Somewhat ironically, Haile Selassie didn't agree. He was no god in his own mind. In an interview with a Canadian journalist asking specifically if he believed that he was Jesus, he said that he privately told the Jamaicans, "I am man, I am mortal, and I shall be replaced by the oncoming generation." And while he was no doubt happy for the international support and notoriety, he had no interest in uniting black people. He certainly didn't want an influx of thousands of poor Jamaicans into his already splintered and impoverished empire. To his followers in the Caribbean, he may have been a uniter of men, but in the home country to many, he was just another imperialist, an emperor. Those that rebelled against his rule were met with military might and ethnic cleansing. But the religion was not born to truth. It was born in response to a lack of truth. Oppression had led to the creation of Rastafarianism, and oppression helped to spread it.
He says the religion was born from a lack of truth, from oppression. Is that so? What is he even trying to say? This is lazy language. This is vague language. Evan is so stuck in his oppression narrative that it becomes his religion. By his logic, all other religions are automatically false if they arose in a situation where one group of people had less power than another. Based on Evan's logic, first you need worldly power, and only then can you have a religion based on truth. This is a simplistic worldview. It's also ridiculous. Why should power make you see the truth? It can just as easily blind you. So there's a few more minutes to the video, but I don't think we need to watch it because he just goes on talking about how Haile Selassie wasn't that great of an emperor and Rastafarianism never really caught on in Ethiopia. There's not really much more for me to comment on. Hasta luego, amigos!